Welcome to the AI Advantage Pro Special event, running the Red Queen's Race with Noah Healy, Part 2. I'm a big old movie nerd, as you've probably worked out, and I use movie and TV metaphors all the time. So the third season of Westworld, where they actually end up in the real world running around and people's whole futures are predicted. The whole lives are defined by one computer. This is all you're ever going to achieve. So,
that's almost like Gattaca.
Oh, I love that film. I just didn't think they built in the potential of AI into that story.
Yeah, it was a very different direction for how that dystopian works.
You could see that whole kind of echo of the fascistic side of how these things can go within Gattaca. And I thought that was very, very interesting at the time.
When England hosted the Olympics, Britain sort of set a record for overperformance that it wasn't East German levels, but it was way high. Mm-hmm. And they did it by doing basically a national measuring off. There was this woman rower that had been like a waitress or something. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that her like forearm to bicep ratio was the best on the planet Earth. And so they just trained her to be a world-class rower in, like a few months.
There's a guy called Colin Jackson, and he was the first man to go under 13 seconds for the 110-meter hurdles. He did a show where he assumed that maybe genetics was part of it, but it was really down to just how much hard work he put in. Well, they analysed him, and he was 90% fast twitch. Your walking speed is probably going to be faster than my flat out.
Right, yeah.
And it's not because you're trying hard, it's just because you are who you are.
Right, yeah. It's one of those things where basically practice can make anybody better, but there really is fitness for a wide variety of tasks.
Within the world of AI and business in general, if we take those metaphors to do with sport, we move from movies to sport, but the thing there is it still sounds like the best athletes are being found to be the best person at the time. So, is it a case of things change? How can this same methodology be applied to business and AI? Because if you think about it, if you are good, if you are smart, and you can apply these tools in a smart way, great. You can still be good, but if you don't apply the tools in the right way, if you don't use the new techniques that have been learned, you're going to get left behind. If you don't use that Fosbury flop, then you're kind of, you're in trouble.
The key is that the field is not static. Mm-hmm. And so the goal in disruption with that bang for the buck is going to be figuring out how to align those disruptions with your own talents and skills.
Okay, and how do you go about identifying where you can really disrupt? Because everybody's got a million ideas, or maybe they've got no ideas at all. It's really, one of the challenges I personally have is trying to keep up with every single thing that's happening with AI. Here I am, I have my podcast, I have my consultancy, and somebody goes, oh, have you heard about this thing? And it's like, I might have heard of it, but have I used it? It's like, right. No. And it's like, I show somebody a tool that I'm using and go, oh yeah, that's a bit like insert name as appropriate. It's like, oh, okay. I've worked really hard to get this one working, but you say you've got something else. It's amazing at the moment, but keeping up with everything is so challenging. What do you suggest there?
Well, again, relevancy. Mm-hmm. So this is where awareness of what you're up to, what the people you're interacting with up to, what your competitors are up to. The entire purpose of markets is to shrink effectively all the information that's required into a price. Mm-hmm. And so that allows you to essentially manage your own interests simply in relation to a single number that's going up and down. So you take everything that's happening on Earth and you turn it into a one-dimensional quantifiable object. That's a much easier thing to cope with, obviously, than trying to keep track of all the news on planet Earth.
So give us an example of that. I mean, have you actually helped somebody or organization do that?
I have worked with people to start setting up indices, and that is one of the potential movements if you start transforming or disrupting your industry, is that your industry might need to actually set up its own marketplace. So I've been very critical of OpenTable and Uber in the past because that model of making yourself the interface to productive activity in order to basically control who gets to be productive based on who's paying you the most kickback for it, isn't something that is actually conducive to society having an advanced economy. And so one of the most powerful kinds of disruptions that's available within this space would be the development of market activities. So a system by which you and your competitors could create a sort of, third party or fourth party type operation that would be at arm's enough length that you are not engaging in collusive
Price fixing, essentially.
Price fixing, yes. To create a simplified interface for yourself and your clients around that space. And by doing that under your own control, you aren't outsourcing your sort of cost and revenue centers to Bezos or Zuckerberg or the Alphabet guys.
That is a really challenging suggestion, though, because you mentioned that there is the potential for collusion, and there's regulation in various parts of the world, certainly in the US, certainly in the UK and Australia, that I've come across, where it's a case of, hey, you don't work with your competitors to fix prices that affect the customers, the consumers. You actually, it's supposed to be competitive. That's the system that we're in. So how do you get that balance right?
That's the point of actually setting up a marketplace, is that the marketplace is competitive. You just put the competition into the marketplace. And so you would need to redefine your services in such a way that they would be marketable in a competitive way across your industry, at which point then you would be engaging in competition there. This is the kind of thing where if you're going to go to a sort of lower touch, this would allow multiple businesses to commonly outsource their marketing and sales needs to this sort of common interface of the marketplace. And then they can focus on improving production, where AI disruption would have different kinds of approaches. You might be looking at, say, using AI to improve your own quality control, so that you could have chatbot monitoring or logging analysis that would be able to take more meticulous notes of what's actually going on in your business on a second-by-second basis, and also summarizing large amounts of information being gathered by logging being done automatically by your operating system and so on. Once again, in hopes of determining what sort of quality of operation and efficiency of operation you can achieve.
It sounds almost like we're heading down the road of trying to create standardized bodies or standardization bodies where it's, hey, we're going to work in this space, and we all want to exist, and it's the classic. And again, going back to the movie side of things, you'd look at the bar scene in A Beautiful Mind, where they're actually trying to work out what's the best overall result, where the most people get benefit. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. So that's where sort of evolutionary ideas and game theory start running into each other. And the bar scene that you're talking about is supposed to be the genesis of the ideas of game theory. But once you have mapped out yourself, your employees, your customers, your competition, their customers, their employees, government regulators, other third-party interests, once you mapped out what they have, what they want, and what they can be given, that's when you have the seeds of understanding how the landscape could be transformed or will be transforming. And that's when you can make truly strategic decisions to deal with what's coming down the pike and what you yourself are going to be sending down the pike.
Does it need government regulation, or is the international nature of what we're doing here, that government regulation is pointless?
Frankly, governments also need to be engaging in this kind of behavior because we are already seeing political disruptions occur at the level of officials and elected bodies. In my country right now, we're having a hard time figuring out how to form a government. And I don't know.
Speaker selection version 2, the sequel this time, it's personal.
Yes, yeah. I don't know when or if they'll figure that one out. So part of the reason that is happening is because it's significantly more challenging to tell the people that you elect what they want to hear and go to Washington and do what they want you to do, because everybody's live on the internet 24/7, and you get to get that back immediately. And so governments also are in the current act of being disrupted by these kinds of things. And once again, imagine a political campaign that is having personal conversations with every single constituent in the constituency.
I mean, that in some ways for politicians, that would be the dream. Being able to literally have those touch points with every single potential voter and have the positive arguments, or even get that feedback so they can change their outlook. If they're hearing that a certain topic is trending well or trending negatively, and they can get it in real time, then politicians aren't exactly adverse to changing their position so that they win.
That seems highly likely. And as the cost of these things shrinks ever more, the cost of actually operating and maintaining such a thing could get down to the point where somebody with, a middle class income and no expensive hobbies could actually deploy such a bot storm themselves. Right now, it's still reasonably expensive, and it's certainly not something that I've seen being deployed. Certainly not publicly, which it absolutely would be by anybody. But this is just another blindingly obvious, clearly functional thing that somebody with a little bit more money than average could decide to do right now in order to achieve effectively guaranteed success.
You've used a phrase there, which it's the first time I heard the phrase, and I love it, a bot storm. I mean, that's such a wonderful phrase to use, but I can see how there is the potential behind it. I mean, we look back at some of the suggestions of what happened with Cambridge Analytica back in the 2016 election and elections around that time. When you apply AI to that and the potential for visual and representations of people, there is some real there.
Yeah. I read an article earlier this year that it was a guy that, as an experiment, decided to figure out how many false personas, including histories, so going out and buying personas, which is a thing you can do of on various social media sites, how many false personas that he could put together for, I believe it was $1,000. And he got about a dozen. He was very sort of open and honest about this. He renamed people. He was buying like dead but reasonable standing Facebook, things that had a decade plus of past history in them. And then he would rename them to things like, I am a fake person. He was trying to be as ethical as possible about this, but he discovered and wrote a few articles about the fact that there were existing botnets of tens to hundreds of thousands and multiples of these non-overlapping botnets. I think 1.8 million springs to mind for some reason as sort of the number of bots he managed to identify, of networks that would parrot and promulgate political messaging. And he saw them, he sort of encountered people that were in the business of buying and selling identities that were sort of hinting at these things. And then as he was starting to bring these things, his sort of little tiny botnet up to snuff, he started to identify the existence of these leviathans that were in the world, as it were.
So this is kind of under the table, these leviathans that you're talking about. We hear the stories of the kind of the troll farms, or the farms where you've got people literally having multiple conversations and deliberately being argumentative to try and
Sure.
But you're saying now that these things have been superseded by automated versions.
This is basically his contention, is that superseded or just augmented, but these were real, that there were these things where if you see 50 different people all agree to something that you don't all personally know, maybe they're all one person that has 10,000 deployed persons to express a message. So it's being used in a much more manipulative way, and a much more under the table way than the sort of more what I would think of as ethical deployment that I was proposing. But that is a real factor, and that real factor will inevitably lead to greater degrees of political runction within a system, because if you have 50,000 bots that are willing to repeat whatever you want them to say, and I have 50,000 bots that are willing to repeat whatever I want them to say, our private disagreement isn't some meaningless private disagreement of two people. It now looks like two real social movements that potentially hate
You've
each
literally
other.
weaponized it. This is one of the areas that I find fascinating. I mean, the number of times when I've been on the odd little Twitter fight, or the odd little chat online, where I've gone back later on and thought to myself, is this a real person I'm talking to? Is this actually somebody who is deliberately being a troll? I mean, everybody can argue if they want to, or be argumentative, but to actually do it at that sort of scale. I mean, I had a very strange little role once where a company I worked for, it was a research department, and we would bring people in and they would have to present to people who were very tough and really, really busy, and people who had to be very positive about their degree of knowledge. So I would rock up at this last interview, and it was part of their final interview, and it'd be all super friendly, but basically I would be an idiot. I would disagree with every single thing that person said, even if I knew they were 100% right. And it was to see how they would react, because they would run into people within the company, and it was kind of bad because thankfully everybody passed. But then the first day that they joined the company, I had to go up and apologize and say, I'm really sorry, that was just a role I was playing. But I can see that same sort of approach being used for both good and bad. Moving away from the political side of things, can you see that same sort of virtual influencer being used around products, and services?
Well, absolutely. So influencers are already used for product and service changes. An event occurred during the COVID lockdowns that caused chess to suddenly become, once again, one of the most popular games on the planet. And that event was something called PogChamps. Okay. And chess.com went out and put together a series, I think there's been 5 of them at this point, of competitions between famous internet streamers, basically. Okay. And so these would be people who, for the most part, had never played chess before. They, on the other hand, they would have hundreds of thousands or millions of people that watch their day-to-day lives as they play games. And so they would have these people do training, in many cases streamed training, with like top 30, 40 chess players. One of the people that chess.com works with a guy named Hikaru Nakamura, who is more or less the second best chess player on earth. He's the best rapid player on earth, the highest rated in rapid.
Speed chess.
Speed chess, yes. So he would train, this person who's never played chess before, but has 10 million people that watch what they do, is training with this other person who is the best human being at playing rapid chess that's ever existed. Okay. And he'd train him how to play chess, and then they would play the tournament, and they'd have these grandmasters doing commentary on these, unbelievably amateurish games, some of which went pretty well, some of which had unbelievably stupid things happening, and they, oh my God, I can't even watch that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Lots of drama, thousands of dollars for charity, hundreds of millions of people watching chess games.
Which is astonishing. That just shows you that people, I have to say, with what you described there, it's the drama. There is obviously somebody that a person would connect to, the influencer, gets them there in the first place. But, I hear stories. My son was telling me the other day about, there's a guy from the UK, older guy from Yorkshire. And so he speaks like this, which is where I'm from originally. And, they have him playing some of the latest video games for the first time. And it's utterly addictive. You don't have to be good. He's now becoming an influencer, and it's going really well. My son said he sat there and he just watched it. He couldn't tear himself away from watching this guy. It was absolutely fascinating.
I'm constantly fascinated by sort of how rapidly we shift into primitivism. The internet comes out, suddenly everybody can communicate with everybody, and business models all go right back to the Bronze Age of sort of merchants that show up with their goods and sell what they have. And everything that people have learned about competitive marketplaces and how to structure, efficient, multi-competitive, multi-sided systems sort of go out the window. Once again, human beings truly love to sit around the campfire and tell stories about what happened that day. And we love to listen to those stories. And with the internet, that's a thing. And that's kind of what keeps Facebook going, is that, here's my day, and here's my crowd that's around my campfire that can watch my day. And so to some extent, you don't need all of this sci-fi knowledge to understand what's going to work, because it's at the end of the day, it's down to what's human. Mm-hmm. What's special about the current round of generative AI is that because it's capturing those styles, those humanish voices, it can trigger these deep-seated and atavistic instincts that we have ourselves. So that part will happen. So the challenge then becomes examining at the strategic level where the environment can change. When you change what's being competed on, who's going to get to win the competition? And will it be your customers? Because now all service is much higher, but everyone's doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. Or will it be your competitors because they crack the code and you don't? Or will it be you because you change the nature of the game so that what you're good at is what makes you win?
So let's, for the last 10 minutes, let's kind of focus on that. I think, you and I could probably talk all day, and there's so many movies I would want to talk about. There's, the one I've always wanted to talk to somebody about, which you might be one of the few people who would know this film, is Colossus: The Forbidden Project.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
I've seen that.
Yeah,
I mentioned that on our podcast a couple ago, I think.
Yeah, and the grand irony being that there's that whole scene where the American computer and the Russian supercomputer, they end up talking to each other and developing a language so they can talk to each other. And then, if I remember correctly, Facebook And was it Facebook and Microsoft had a similar situation happen where they had two AIs, and the AIs did develop their own language to be able to talk to each other. So they switched them off really, really quickly. There was something like that happened a few years ago.
Well, yeah, ChatGPT has done experiments of having it talk to itself, and without an external governor, it starts losing human language and starts talking it starts making noises in sort of just character strings,
which again is just the same sort of abbreviations in some ways that humans come up with. Everybody comes up with an acronym, or everybody comes up with a nickname for something that's got a long, complicated name. So it's, again, AI is a really good mirror of us. It just does it way more efficiently, but sometimes without having those ethics, which is obviously one of the areas that you and I have talked about. It's super ethics for super intelligence, which is the first conversation we had. And it's always something that I've thought about, how do you come up with those super ethics? And it's, but I mean, from the business side of things, tell us about the way you approach companies. When you go in, we've already talked about, you've got to do that analysis. You've got to look at the areas where you can actually start to say, okay, these are the areas that can be disrupted. And also, but starting from within, don't just worry about your competitors. Let's apply that analysis to you, see where your weaknesses are. What are the steps beyond that? So you've chosen what you're going to do. How do you make sure that's applied in the best way possible?
Well, the key thing for any approach I can do, and this gets back to the super ethics thing, is measurement. So first problem is working out how to create a quantification attached to this thing. And there are some fairly general techniques that are available, thanks to information theory, that allow us to actually measure information. So we talked earlier a little bit about how ChatGPT can create these big vectors to sort of identify what kinds of information belong where in its visualization space. Those sorts of approaches actually work pretty much identically in any business. You can essentially take every single one of those relationships and interests and assign its own metric from, scales of 1 to 5 or engagement, or really whatever turns out to be appropriate. And then the set of those things can be aggregated together through this mathematical technique called outer products into these geometric algebra sort of vector, bivector, trivector things, which will then contain the necessary information. And so then the next stage is to work out the spatial structure, if you will. So once you've identified a set of these things, then you can establish a landscape, which for small dimensional systems will be directly visualizable, but in larger dimensional systems, you can still, there's basic approaches that allow you to understand the structure of that landscape. And it is the structure of that landscape that is serves as the basis for judging whether things are moving stuff in the direction you want them to go or away from the direction you want them to go, what sorts of structural issues will exist in competition or otherwise. And so by figuring those things out, you can then set up the systems with KPI monitoring that will be checking locations within these spaces that will be able to provide gauges that basically tell you whether things are heading the direction you were intending or whether they're heading in some other direction. And if they're heading in some other direction, then similar kinds of analysis can tell you whether or not that's because of your failure of execution or everything's iterative. You go back, it might be that your picture of the landscape has changed, potentially because your competitors are also going to be doing things like this.
So there's some classic standard advice really there from what I'm hearing. It's hey, yeah, you're making a change. Constantly monitor to make sure that everything's okay and things are working, but don't be surprised if your guys your competitors are doing the same sort of thing. There's one of the metaphors I like to use is you go into a boxing gym, and invariably there's a poster up on the wall which says your competitor is training harder than you are. And it's just, trying to motivate people to, this is not a one and done deal. This is not a case of, you've applied AI or you've done that analysis and then we're all good. We've got to keep checking it.
Well, yeah. Going back all the way to the Red Queen at the beginning and what we were talking about before with sort of the athletes, if AI can disrupt your industry, which is pretty nearly certain, and it redefines what's important about your company to some aspect of what you're currently doing, it's going to do that for your competition too. And if it turns out that the distribution of that aspect is similar to the distribution of how your companies are presently doing, all of this disruption will simply result in having companies that are operating with about the same amount of your market share that you're presently gaining. The caveat, the flip side of this is that if you don't engage in this disruption, you'll simply be left by the wayside.
And again, we're back to the Red Queen, running as fast as you can just to stay still. Yeah.
Precisely.
And that's a beautiful way to define it. Final question I'm going to ask you today, and we can certainly have follow-on conversations, and we'll do more later on. But final question I'm going to ask you today is, a lot of what we've talked about today is disruption. And a lot of the disruption that I see is, the classic, it's going to take our jobs. If you were advising people on potential retraining, or if they were, going to make suggestions to their kids about the sort of things that they should be focusing on, at high school, college, whatever it might be, what are the areas that you see a growth that has great potential within the world of AI? And it doesn't have to be the pure technical side. What are the areas that you think people should be looking at that have maybe more traditional skills and can take advantage of AI?
I think ethics is heavily underserved. You'd mentioned earlier about the apparent domination of sociopathy in management. I think that that's an overrepresentation from the studies I've read, and not actually a domination, but it may well be over 50%. And we certainly see, I've seen multiple studies pointing out that MBA programs graduate people with more sociopathic tendencies than they admit. So that's not a comfortable direction for things to be moving. But ethics is a much, much more important question in a world where the ground is shifting under your feet. And when thinking about how to disrupt things becomes the most effective way to do sales and marketing and production and product development, which is coming soon to every business near you, then thinking through how to use competition and use cooperation and use these various ideas in constructive ways rather than destructive ways are going to be the crux of the matter. Because if we don't come up with these ethical engagements, our sort of natural fractiousness is just going to be amplified by these machines that are frankly just going to do anything we tell them to do. And
they don't care.
Right. And so if we just allow natural fractiousness to be the driving force of what we tell them to do, we're just going to create enormous amounts of noise and confusion and conflict. And that's going to be bad for everybody.
I'm going to draw this to a close today, but great talking to you again as ever. That concludes the recorded section of Running the Red Queen's Race with Noah Healy. Join us for the live November event, where you can meet Noah and ask him your own questions. Sign up at AI-Advantage.show under live networking. See you soon.